Hey guys, tonight we're headed down a narrow alley that smells faintly of garlic dust and something more ambiguous, possibly wet marble or someone's forgotten laundry stew. The sun's gone down over Rome, casting its last orange sigh across terracotta roofs and into the shuttered windows of the insula, those marvelous, improbable Roman apartment buildings stacked like layer cakes built by a drunk uncle. Somewhere a goat sneezes from a stairwell. Somewhere else a landlord sighs into his wine cup, wondering if today is the day the second floor finally collapses. If you've ever thought modern apartment living was chaotic, let me introduce you to the ancient Roman version, where your ceiling might be your neighbor's floor, your neighbor might be a retired gladiator with a loud parrot, and your plumbing system might involve yelling down a shaft and hoping someone with a bucket is listening. You probably wouldn't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, leave a comment sharing where and when you're listening from bonus points if you're doing it while lying on a suspiciously squeaky mattress. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The old innkeeper squinted across the square. At the building opposite, a 7-story beast with mismatched shutters, laundry strung like prayers between balconies, and a suspicious lean to the left. That one's been leaning for 37 years, he muttered to no one, or perhaps to the goat chewing parchment beside him. Still standing, mostly. The insula, Latin for island, was Rome's answer to housing the masses, its teeming, bustling, cabbage-scented masses. Built tall to conserve space, these early apartment blocks were home to everyone from bakers and prostitutes to poets, and that one guy who ran an illegal dice ring on the roof. At first glance, they looked noble enough. Stuccoed fronts, painted columns, maybe even a mosaic floor in the entryway, if the landlord was feeling optimistic that decade. But behind the surface, chaos. Glorious, unpredictable, rat-infested chaos. Being a landlord, dominus insulae, wasn't a job you chose because you loved people. No, you chose it because you loved bribes control, or perhaps you'd lost a bet. It was a job that required diplomacy, a deep understanding of plumbing that didn't exist, and strong calves for the endless stairs. Ladders, too, if your building had reached that final stage of evolution, where the top floors were accessible only via rope faith or very determined pigeons. Most insulae were built of timber mud bricks and hope, which is to say they were highly flammable and occasionally fell over if you sneezed too hard. Wealthier tenants might inhabit the lower floors with their own toilets and running water luxuries, while the poor folk clambered up narrow staircases to garrets that rattled when the wind changed moods. The top floor, where rent was cheapest and sanity optional, had ceilings so low that most tenants walked with a stoop and a prayer. One historical record claims there were over 40,000 insulae in Rome by the early imperial period. Another says, no, it was more like 46,602, which is such a specific number that historians immediately began fighting over it. They're still fighting probably somewhere over a lukewarm espresso and a copy of Vitruvius. But no matter how many there were, they all had the same charm, an illusion of grandeur that dissolved upon closer inspection, a mosaic of Neptune in the lobby. Beautiful, just ignore the cracked tiles and the bucket-catching leaks in the corner. Decorative columns out front. Lovely if you don't mind that one of them is made of painted wood and held together with fig paste. And always, always there was the courtyard, the heart of the building, where children screamed, chickens wandered freely, and someone was always boiling cabbage at 3 p.m. You'd hear bards attempting romantic serenades. You'd hear bards failing romantic serenades. And occasionally you'd hear a tenant shout, "Whose goat ate my tunic into the void." The landlord, let's call him Flavius, because all bad landlords are named Flavius in bedtime stories, woke each morning to a series of decisions: which wall to patch, which tenant to avoid, which broken stair to ignore, and whether today was a good day to pretend he was just the janitor. One of Flavius's tenants was a retired centurion who insisted on bathing at dawn while singing all 5 verses of a very specific victory hymn. Another was a poetess who raised pigeons on her windowsill and trained them to deliver passive-aggressive notes to her ex-husband on the 3rd floor. Neither paid rent on time. Both claimed the other was the reason the building trembled during thunderstorms. And then there were the mice. The mice bold as emperors, and twice as cunning, had their own informal governing body beneath the floorboards. They held meetings. They stole socks. One once dragged a gold coin under the stairs and was later declared a minor deity by the neighborhood children. That first evening, as we settle into this meandering tale, just imagine sitting on a creaking balcony above a courtyard filled with stew steam and slow arguments. Somewhere a woman is yelling about her missing sandals. Somewhere else a man is composing a haiku about mold. And overhead the plaster ceiling sighs deeply, as if it too longs for a simpler life. It's a city of stacked dreams and stacked debts. And Flavius, tired tunic, slightly scorched from yesterday's kitchen, Fire smiles at the rising moon and thinks, well, at least the goat hasn't learned to open doors yet. The job, if one could call it that without cursing, was simple. In theory, collect rent, maintain the property, and keep the peace between tenants who only agreed on one thing: that the landlord was almost certainly the problem. Flavius, like many in his profession, preferred to describe his duties as preventative chaos management. A more honest title might have been architect of delayed disaster. Each morning, Flavius would descend from his own modest chamber, 2nd floor, front-facing, just above the bakery that produced both bread and perpetual shouting, and begin his circuit. The building, like many in its condition, did not enjoy mornings. Its shutters hung at odd angles. Its door groaned like an elderly philosopher, and at least one of its staircases had grown moss, an achievement, considering it received no sunlight and hosted no plants. The front hall welcomed visitors with a mural of Mercury that had long since lost his face to soot and time. Below it hung a sign painted by a tenant with shaky hands and strong opinions. No goats beyond this point. It was, of course, universally ignored. The staircases wound upward in tight spirals built for Roman sandals and not modern common sense. They tilted just enough to make climbing feel like penance, and descended with the kind of speed that encouraged falling rather than walking. The wealthier buildings had internal stairwells of brick. Flavius had one staircase a rope ladder for emergencies, and something vaguely resembling a vine that had learned to support weight, if asked nicely. At the 3rd floor landing home to the bath-singing centurion and his long-suffering neighbor, a woman who baked pies at inappropriate hours, Flavius paused to inspect a crack that had grown since yesterday. He poked it with a thumb, nodded sagely, and made a mental note to absolutely ignore that until it becomes someone else's problem. Being a dominus insulae meant being a little bit janitor, a little bit magistrate, and a great deal actor. Tenants had complaints, of course. Some had legitimate ones, like the tenant on the 6th floor who swore the wall was leaking not rain but vinegar. Others leaned toward the mystical. One woman insisted her room contained a ghost that smelled of garlic and whispered the word taxes in her ear every Saturn's day. Flavius offered to raise her rent and said that usually scared spirits off. She was not amused. But the worst tenants weren't the loud ones or the mysterious ones, or even the ones who practiced amateur dentistry on the balcony. And yes, that did happen. The worst were the polite ones, the ones who smiled too broadly and paid precisely 2 denarii short every month, with a cheerful shrug and a promise that they were so close friend, so close. These were the ones you had to watch. They'd charm your sandals off while stealing your roof tiles. Historically speaking, landlords weren't known for kindness. Seneca himself once complained about his landlord raising rent during a thunderstorm. Other writers of the time didn't even bother hiding their scorn. Being a dominus insulae was less a profession than a tolerated evil. And yet Flavius was one of the better ones. He hadn't pushed anyone down the stairs in over 3 months. A personal best. On this particular day, he found a tenant attempting to bribe him with a handful of olives and a small statue of Bacchus missing its nose. "I carved it myself," said the tenant, a former soap maker turned aspiring sculptor. Flavius accepted the offering with a nod and set it atop a windowsill already cluttered with various bribes, a dried fish, a slightly cracked amphora, and a scroll containing a bawdy limerick involving Jupiter and a donkey. Bribes were part of the dance. You couldn't just demand rent. You had to perform. Smile, listen, nod dramatically. Sometimes you shared a cup of watered wine and pretended the hole in the wall was an artistic decision. Other times, you told tenants they were like family, which in Roman terms meant you were preparing to betray them, slightly less than you would a stranger. The joy of it all, if you could call it joy, was in the repetition. The same tenants, the same problems, the same ridiculous, cabbage-scented rhythm. Occasionally a tenant would move out, and for a brief moment hope would bloom. Maybe this time someone quiet would move in, someone clean, someone who didn't worship Minerva by chanting at dawn with cymbals. It never happened. The gods had a sense of humor. Flavius' personal favorite tenant, if such a creature could exist, lived in a windowless room beneath the stairs and wrote tragic plays about frogs. He never complained. He rarely left. And once, during a citywide blackout caused by an overeager chariot crashing into an aqueduct, he hosted an impromptu shadow puppet theater that somehow made 3 women cry, and 1 man propose marriage. Art Flavius muttered, passing the man's door and hearing the soft croak of rehearsal. Not all landlords lived on site, of course. Some were wealthy patricians who owned several buildings and delegated the grime to hired managers called insulari. These unlucky souls were expected to oversee maintenance report damages and absorb all tenant wrath like a very polite sponge. Flavius was both landlord and manager, a rare hybrid known to work for dinner scraps and fleeting respect. And what did he receive for all this rent? Usually, sometimes, in theory, but mostly he received stories and splinters, and the occasional appreciation of a tenant who said, "Thank you for not letting the roof kill me this week." High praise indeed. As the day wore on, Flavius found himself at the building's entrance once more. A cat slinked past tail high, clearly judging the human race. The goat bleated softly from the courtyard, and a child screamed something about fermented turnips. The building creaked like a tired bard tuning his lute. Flavius leaned on the doorframe, breathing in the scent of roasted garlic, wet limestone, and mild despair. Another day done. Another 10,000 stairs climbed. And tomorrow would bring more of the same. He wouldn't have it any other way. Probably, Rent Day in Rome was less a scheduled event and more a minor festival of denial, improvisation, and theatrical excuses. It arrived not on the calendar, but in the air, like the first scent of summer, or the sudden silence that comes just before a goat does something unspeakable. Flavius knew the signs. Tenants began to hum nervously in the stairwells. The poetess on the 5th floor started leaving passive-aggressive verses nailed to the stair railings. Rent is due, but coins are few, perhaps except a pie or two. Someone inevitably cooked a suspiciously large batch of lentil stew, the smell of which was known to lure landlords into negotiation or temporary amnesia. And the building itself seemed to groan louder, as if conspiring with the tenants to discourage the idea of monetary responsibility. The official method was simple. Flavius knocked. They opened. Coins changed hands. Receipts were scribbled. Everyone moved on with their lives. But this was Rome. Nothing was ever that simple. Take, for instance, old Marcellus in room 1A, a man with 2 working knees, 1 working eye, and 0 working sense of financial timing. Every month Marcellus claimed he was just waiting on payment from a cousin who was definitely real and definitely in charge of a marble quarry somewhere near Capua. This cousin never appeared. But Marcellus, with impressive optimism, continued to offer Flavius various objects of comparable value. These included 1 half-melted wax statue of a senator, 3 jars of unidentifiable jam, and an angry pigeon wearing a bell. Then there was Lucilla on the 3rd floor, who had decided that rent was a patriarchal construct and preferred to pay with spirited philosophical debate. What is rent really, she would ask, arms outstretched, if not a social illusion, enforced by tired men with lists Flavius once tried to answer, but gave up, somewhere around her 3rd footnote about Plato's views on cabbage. Rent collection therefore became an art, a dance, a negotiation performed with arched brows, dramatic sighs, and the occasional loaf of bread as both weapon and peace offering. There was also the matter of how rent was calculated. In wealthier insulae, rent might be standardized, even recorded, but in Flavius's domain, it fluctuated according to complex, deeply irrational math involving how much noise a tenant made, how many goats they were responsible for, and whether they had ever attempted to build a second oven without permission. The 4th floor couple with the twin toddlers, for instance, received a slight discount for being predictably loud but consistently clean. The man who practiced chariot racing on the roof paid double. And the tenant who insisted on keeping a small shrine to Romulus, made entirely out of chewed olive pits. He got away with nearly everything because no one wanted to touch that situation. Flavius did have a ledger, of course. It was a leather-bound affair covered in wine stains, burnt at the corners, and occasionally nibbled by mice. It contained rows of names, numbers, and cryptic notes like smells like vinegar investigate or owes 3 months plus stew. Historians still argue whether landlords in ancient Rome actually kept reliable financial records. Some say the state mandated it. Others point out that most landlords were too busy chasing fleeing tenants to bother with ink. One papyrus from Alexandria lists a full page of rent dodgers, each annotated with increasingly creative insults in the margins. Scholars remain divided over whether this was standard practice or simply the venting of a man on the brink. Flavius, for his part, believed in partial accounting. He wrote down what he remembered. He remembered what seemed important. And if he forgot a payment here or there, well, so long as the tenant hadn't set fire to the stairs or attempted to bribe him with interpretive dance again, it could be forgiven. Still, every now and then, someone paid in full, with actual coin, early, and those moments felt like minor miracles. On this particular rent day, the surprise came from young Publius, the scroll seller's apprentice, on the 6th floor. He handed over a full pouch of denarii with a proud smile and said, "No ghosts this month, sir." Felt it was a good omen. Flavius blinked. "You're paid up?" "Yes, sir. No favors, no stew, no interpretive lecture on Jupiter's economic policies?" "No, sir." "Are you ill?" Publius assured him he was fine, handed over a second coin for the building, and trotted back up the stairs like someone who hadn't yet lived through a Roman winter on the 6th floor. It gave Flavius a moment of joy, followed by immediate suspicion. That sort of punctuality didn't occur naturally. Elsewhere, negotiations were slower. The bard in room 2B had written an epic poem in lieu of rent, which he insisted contained coded references to the exact amount owed. Flavius made it to the 3rd stanza before declaring it spiritually taxing and demanding coin or cabbage. The bard affronted promised a musical duel instead. This Flavius noted in his ledger with an asterisk and the word pending. And then came the wine bribes. Oh, the wine bribes. It was customary, especially among the more seasoned tenants, to offer a cup of watered wine as a prelude to the rent conversation. The wine was rarely good, occasionally flammable, and often followed by long stories about dead relatives and missing jars of coin. Flavius developed a palate for lies flavored with tannins and desperation. One woman served a wine so bitter it could strip paint. She claimed it came from a monastery. Flavius believed her. No sane winemaker would confess to such a creation. The sun eventually dipped below the rooftops. Flavius, heavier of purse and heart, made his way back to the ground floor. Rent day, as always, had left him tired, slightly sticky from handling too many amphorae, and quietly amused. He counted the coin later by lamplight, enough to pay the city inspector patch the courtyard well, and maybe hire someone to investigate the noise behind the walls. It had been growing louder, clicking, or perhaps laughing. He paused at the window. The moon hung over the city like an old silver coin no one had the heart to spend. Somewhere someone shouted about a missing goat. Again. Rent was due, rent was paid. Life rolled on, as it always did in Rome, messily, musically, and with just enough chaos to keep things interesting. The 4th floor was missing a roof. Not the whole thing, mind you. That would have been too generous. No, the 4th floor had what Flavius referred to with impressive optimism as partial coverage, by which he meant there was one remaining stretch of tile above the stairwell that had not yet succumbed to wind rot or a poorly thrown amphora from the tenant who practiced discus techniques after too much wine. The roof had once been glorious, or at least functional. Clay tiles layered like fish scales, angled just enough to funnel rainwater into a cistern that hadn't worked properly since the year of the barking comet. But over the years, time and weather, and a very unfortunate goat-related incident had reduced the upper level's protection to a kind of elaborate suggestion. And yet people still lived there, willingly. The top floors of a Roman insula were the cheapest, for good reason. Climbing up was a feat in itself, and coming down was sometimes best accomplished with a controlled tumble. But for those without the coin or the political clout to claim a lower level dwelling, the fourth or fifth floor offered privacy, cold breezes, and the sort of view that poets called soulful and landlords called structurally unwise. One tenant in particular, a wiry ex-philosopher named Doris, had lived beneath the holy roof for nearly a decade. He claimed to enjoy it, said the rain clarified his thoughts. When it rained sideways, which it often did, Doris would simply wrap himself in 2 togas and meditate under a slab of bark he'd nailed to a support beam. This is how the Stoics did it. He claimed ignoring the fact that most Stoics had actual buildings to think inside. The hole had been patched. Once. Sort of. A previous tenant, in a fit of invention and wine, had attempted to construct a replacement roof from woven reeds and discarded fish crates. It held for about 3 days, till the great wind of festival week carried the whole thing off like a chariot of poorly chosen dreams. Witnesses swore it spiraled into the sky with such grace that even Jupiter might have paused to admire the chaos. After that, Flavius gave up on formal repairs and began referring to it as an open-air design, which sounded intentional and confused the building inspector just long enough for the bribe to kick in. Historians still argue about the safety of upper-floor living in Roman insulae. Some say it was a death trap, walls too thin, materials too cheap, exits too far. Others insist that certain buildings were sturdier than expected, built by architects with pride and the good fortune to avoid working for Flavius. What's not debated is that fires started more easily on upper floors, and collapsed beams rarely warned anyone before giving up. The poetess on floor 5 once described it as living on the edge of Olympus with slightly more mildew. Water, too, was a persistent problem. Flavius had long since accepted that leaks were less an issue to be fixed and more a mood to be endured. Rain pooled between tiles, crept along beams, and occasionally dripped in rhythmic patterns that made children believe the gods were trying to play music through their ceilings. One memorable night, a sudden thunderstorm brought half the 4th floor's ceiling crashing down into Doris's lap. He barely flinched, merely shifting his position and muttering, "Ah," a lesson in impermanence. The next day he constructed a hammock out of his wet tunics and declared it superior to beds with their false promises of support. But it wasn't just weather that complicated things. Pigeons. Pigeons ruled the upper floors with an authority previously reserved for emperors. They nested in cracks, cooed loudly during disputes, and occasionally delivered ominous feathers to people who complained too much. Flavius suspected that some tenants had developed informal treaties with the birds. Others, like the bard in 3b, claimed the pigeons were spies for a rival landlord across the alley. Flavius didn't believe that. Not really. But once, when trying to evict a tenant for unpaid rent, a pigeon dive-bombed his scrolls and relieved itself with surgical precision. He'd been wary ever since. The lack of a roof also meant tenants were more exposed to sounds from the city, the clatter of carts, the cries of vendors, the endless drumming of someone practicing war rhythms in the plaza. Doris claimed that this was a blessing. "I hear Rome breathe," he said. "I feel its pulse." Flavius nodded politely and made a note to charge him an extra coin for enhanced acoustic ambiance. Despite it all, the 4th floor remained occupied. Always. Whenever someone moved out, or more often moved down due to a sudden beam-related injury, someone else took their place. Usually someone new to the city, filled with optimism and a desire to live like a real Roman. These hopefuls lasted anywhere from 1 month to 3, depending on their tolerance for nocturnal weatherbird conspiracies and furniture that occasionally walked on its own. It became a rite of passage almost. Survived the top floor, and you earned the respect of your fellow tenants, or at least the cautious admiration of the goat who often wandered up there to eat moss and silently judge the living. Flavius rarely climbed that high anymore. His knees protested, and the ladder he once used had been repurposed by a tenant who believed it made a better bookshelf. Now, if he absolutely had to check on the roof, or what was left of it, he did so from across the courtyard with a long stick, a mirror, and the reluctant assistance of a boy named Crispus, who had terrible balance and no fear of falling. One day Flavius thought the roof would go entirely, not in a blaze or collapse, but slowly, piece by piece, until the stars became part of the architecture and the pigeons crowned themselves owners. And when that happened, he would nod and say, "Ah, yes, the open design is finally complete." Because in Rome, things didn't fall apart all at once. They drifted, crumbled, leaked, and occasionally flew off on festival winds to become someone else's problem. The walls were thin, not metaphorically, not emotionally, though there was certainly no shortage of drama among the tenants, but literally. The walls in Flavius' building, like in many Roman insulae, were composed of a careful blend of timber mud brick and the architectural equivalent of wishful thinking. On good days they held, on bad days they breathed, on festival days they hummed ominously. Tenants quickly learned that privacy was an illusion. A whispered argument between lovers on the second floor could be heard verbatim on the fifth, often with editorial commentary provided by a widow with strong opinions and very little else to do. Entire romances blossomed and withered without the participants ever meeting in person, only their voices carried through cracks in plaster and floors that functioned like amphitheaters designed by drunk poets. Take, for example, Sextus and Laelia. Sextus, a sandal maker with a nervous twitch and a fondness for fermented garlic, lived on the second floor. Laelia, a retired bathhouse attendant turned aspiring playwright, inhabited the room directly above him. For weeks, they argued daily loudly about the fate of a fictional heroine named Clytemnestra, who Sextus insisted was unfairly maligned. Laelia, who had written Clytemnestra's dialogue herself, was not amused. Their shouting matches became a form of communal entertainment. Other tenants scheduled meals around them. A child once took bets on which insult would be shouted first each morning. Fish-breathed tragedian and sandal-sniffing hack were favorites. Then, quite suddenly, the arguments stopped, and the next week a duet emerged. It was off-key, it was mournful, it was undeniably a love song written in 2 parts and performed daily at dusk. The walls might not have been strong, but they were certainly efficient. Flavius, of course, had no illusions about the building's acoustics. He'd once sneezed on the ground floor and heard someone bless him from the attic. But there were limits to what even he could tolerate, like when Gaius, a tenant on the 3rd floor, decided to begin training as a musician. A tibason, a flute player. His playing sounded like a goose being strangled with an oiled rope. It started at sunrise and ended when someone threw a loaf of stale bread through his window. Gaius considered this applause and took it as encouragement. The bard from Room 2B tried to be supportive. He even composed a ballad titled "Ode to a Dying Reed" in Gaius's honor. It was not well received. Some tenants attempted to muffle the noise with wool-stuffed crevices or heavy tapestries. Others retaliated by making more noise themselves, banging pots, stomping in rhythm, or in one case, yelling the works of Virgil in angry cadence until someone begged for mercy. Flavius considered implementing a curfew, but curfews required enforcement, and enforcement required energy. Instead, he put up a sign near the stairwell that read, "Please consider the gods and your neighbors before attempting music, especially the gods." It was swiftly ignored. Of course, sound wasn't the only thing that passed through the building freely. Smells wandered without shame. Stew vapors, burnt herbs, incense from questionable rituals, and the eternal perfume of boiled cabbage. The building had, according to legend, been cursed by a very disappointed cook centuries ago, and no matter how many times the tenants tried to cleanse it with laurel smoke, the scent of overcooked legumes remained. One particular scent, memorable even by Roman standards, emerged from room 4C, occupied by a man who claimed to be a philosopher, but may have just been bad at cleaning. He said he was distilling essence of virtue. Everyone else said he was melting socks. Flavius visited him once to inquire if perhaps he was cooking something that could legally be defined as food. The man offered him a cup of something bubbling and blue. Flavius declined, left quickly, and added a new entry to the ledger 4C, possible alchemist or lunatic. Monitor for explosions. Even everyday arguments became part of the architecture. Lovers quarreled and reconciled. Mothers scolded children, and occasionally someone delivered a monologue to a pigeon. One of the most persistent voices came from old Rhea, a widow of indeterminate age who lived on the first floor and had absolutely no boundaries. Rhea knew everyone's business. She heard everything, saw everything, and shared everything whether you asked or not. Lucius came home drunk again. She would whisper loudly to passing neighbors. Said he'd fallen into a well. A well, I ask you, have you ever seen a well near this building? No, you haven't. She also took it upon herself to document the building's history via gossip. It was said she could recite the last 12 tenants of any room, their vices, lovers' debts, and stew preferences with alarming accuracy. Her apartment fittingly was wallpapered in scribbled notes, half-finished poems, and what might have been a wanted poster for a particularly rude chicken. And yet, despite all this chaos, perhaps because of it, the building thrummed with life, with story, with the kind of ceaseless, joyful noise that meant people were surviving, even if barely. Historians still argue whether Roman tenants found this tolerable or torturous. Some letters survive complaining of thin walls and loud neighbors. Others speak of shared songs, of voices echoing through the night, like a chorus of humanity itself. Maybe it was both. Flavius, leaning against the stairwell one night, listened to the blend of sound drifting through the structure, a mother soothing a child, a bard plucking a lyre, someone practicing curses in Greek, and the steady, contented snore of a goat curled up beneath the stairs. He took a long sip of wine and smiled. Yes, the walls were thin, but sometimes thin walls made it easier to remember you weren't alone. There were tenants who moved out, there were tenants who moved in, and then there were tenants who simply lingered. Some claimed they'd been there since the days of Augustus, which was impressive given their suspiciously youthful knees. Others had no memory of ever signing a lease, but insisted that their presence was part of the building's original design. A few, disturbingly, had not been seen in years, yet rent continued to arrive, usually in jars. sometimes accompanied by a single olive and a note that simply read, "All is well." These were the tenants who never left, alive or otherwise. Room 1C was the most famous example. It had once belonged to a tailor named Marcus, known for two things: an impeccable wardrobe and a nervous laugh that sounded like a squeaky hinge. He paid rent on time, hosted quiet dinners, and occasionally gave fashion advice to the goat in the courtyard. Then one spring morning, Marcus stopped answering his door. Flavius knocked. No response. He shouted. Still nothing. Eventually, after assembling a team of reluctant neighbors and bribing them with honey cakes, he forced the door open only to find the room perfectly empty. No Marcus, no furniture, not even a pillow out of place. Just a folded tunic on the bed and a single coin placed gently on the window ledge. Spooky, yes. Suspicious extremely. But what truly puzzled Flavius was that a month later the rent for room 1C appeared as usual. Same coin, same window. Every month since. At first he tried to investigate. He camped outside the room. Nothing. He asked neighbors. They said the room felt watched. One swore she heard someone humming Ave Fortuna at midnight, though no one else confirmed this. Eventually Flavius gave up and just labeled it Haunted Reliable in the ledger. Historians still argue whether Romans believed in ghosts the way modern people do. There are records of hauntings, of course ghosts appearing to warn of unpaid debts, ancient spirits whispering messages through fig trees, entire cemeteries rumored to throw parties in the moonlight. But more often than not, ghosts in Roman writing were less spooky specters and more bureaucratic nuisances. Take the case of Quintus in room 5B. Quintus had lived in the building for over 20 years, during which time he successfully annoyed every single other tenant. He was fond of drumming at odd hours, reading his scrolls aloud with theatrical flair, and boiling fish, indoors, with no windows open. When he finally passed away, peacefully, and in his sleep, to the deep relief of everyone, his absence was celebrated with quiet joy and a minor festival involving pastries. Then about a week later, strange things began to happen. His favorite scroll was found back on the lectern. The smell of overcooked fish returned, and late at night tenants reported hearing a raspy voice loudly reciting verses from Ovid's Metamorphoses, particularly the bits about transformation and weeping nymphs. No one wanted to go back into 5B. Flavius offered the room to a young couple once. They lasted 2 nights and claimed their dreams had been narrated. One of them woke up, quoting Latin she didn't know. Eventually Flavius hung a curtain over the door and declared it a storage room, for what no one was quite sure. But every now and then a scroll would appear outside the curtain as if being graded. There was also the tale of Gellia, a long-departed tenant who reportedly died mid-laundry and was said to still fold the bedsheets of those who didn't show proper respect to their linens. The second-floor hallway sometimes carried the smell of wet cloth, even in summer. One tenant claimed her toga was pressed and folded neatly on her bed after she tossed it on the floor. She moved out the next day citing excessive tidiness. Then there was the goat. Flavius didn't know where the goat had come from. No one did. One day it simply appeared, standing on the stairs with the calm confidence of a philosopher who had solved all earthly concerns. It never made a sound, never climbed past the 3rd floor, and never accepted food unless it was bread, offered respectfully with both hands. It was unclear who owned the goat. Some said it belonged to a tenant long gone. Others insisted it was the reincarnation of a forgotten god. Rhea, the 1st-floor widow, claimed the goat whispered her secrets. No one questioned this, mostly out of fear that the goat would develop opinions on rent. But the strangest story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, was of Decimus, a tenant who had clearly died. Flavius remembered it. Everyone did. There had been a procession incense, crying a poorly tuned lyre the whole bit. Yet a full year later, someone reported seeing Decimus in the stairwell carrying a basket of figs and complaining about the new olive merchant. Flavius confronted the room in question, 3C, and found it occupied. The door opened. Decimus stood there looking mildly surprised, as if Flavius had interrupted a very dull nap. "You're dead," Flavius had said, as one does. "So I've heard," Decimus replied, and closed the door. After a few more sightings, tenants stopped bringing it up. Rent continued to be paid. The room remained quiet. Flavius scribbled, "possibly alive," in the ledger, and decided not to push it, because in Rome some tenants didn't leave, not because they loved the location, not because they feared the afterlife, but because rent was cheaper than resurrection, and possibly because the goat wouldn't let them. One of the great design features, if design is the word, and feature is meant generously, of a Roman insula was the utter lack of private latrines. While wealthier villas might enjoy indoor plumbing and mosaic-tiled bathrooms where one could ponder life in peace, most apartment dwellers were given two choices: share a communal public latrine somewhere down the street or get creative. Guess which option prevailed? On paper, again, very generous. The apartments had access to neighborhood forky public latrines with stone benches carved into an elegant row of collective compromise. These were social spaces, believe it or not. People discussed politics while seated, compared hemorrhoids like sports injuries, and debated the best kind of sea sponge for cleaning up afterward. There was no privacy. There was, however, a constant trickle of water and a general scent of discontent. But walking down 3 flights of stairs and across a plaza to sit on a cold slab of marble surrounded by your neighbors was, shall we say, not everyone's dream. Especially not at night. Especially not during festival season. Especially not if you had a stomach cursed by suspicious stew. Thus was born the chamber pot economy. Every tenant had 1 terracotta bronze, occasionally just a bucket that had ambitions. These vessels lived discreetly under beds or behind curtains, only to be summoned at moments of quiet urgency or dramatic inconvenience. Some were plain, others disturbingly were decorated with reliefs of gods who looked very disappointed to be involved. And during the night, when the chamber pots grew full and patience grew thin, there came a moment dreaded by all but anticipated by none: the window dump. Yes, the Roman tradition of ejecting one's business from the upper floors into the alley below was not just real, it was routine. Tenants were supposed to shout "cave canum" or something equally polite before launching the contents. Some did. Most didn't. Flavius had tried to implement rules. He posted signs. He held meetings. He even designated a corner of the courtyard as a waste mound of last resort and hired a boy named Felix to monitor nighttime noises. It helped very little. One morning, a visiting priest was struck by a mystery liquid while walking beneath the 4th floor. He claimed divine punishment and promptly retired to the countryside. A philosopher received a surprise blessing to the back of his toga and spent the next week writing bitter verses about the unpredictability of fate. And a local baker, furious about his soiled loaves, once stood in the street for 3 hours shouting curses so creative they were later adopted into popular plays. The goat, of course, remained untouched. Some say the goat could sense danger. Others suspected the goat was behind the worst of it. To be fair, not all waste was handled with such disregard. Some tenants were more thoughtful. They crept down in the early hours with covered pots, emptying them into the drainage system near the bathhouse or bribing laborers to add it to the compost piles outside the market. A few tried burying the evidence beneath the flower boxes on their balconies, which explains why the basil in room 2D had a haunting aroma no one could quite place. Historians still argue over the efficiency of Roman waste management. Rome had cloacae, a sewer system impressive for its time, but it was far from perfect. Backflow, overflow, and no flow were all common events. Wealthy homes had private connections to the system. Everyone else relied on gravity prayer and increasingly unreliable neighbors. Flavius once attempted a grand improvement. He hired a man who claimed to be an aqua technicianus, a self-styled water engineer, who wore an apron embroidered with tiny amphorae and spoke only in riddles. The man inspected the building's cistern, nodded gravely, then disappeared into the alley, muttering something about hydraulic vengeance. 3 days later, the building's only standing latrine exploded. After that, Flavius returned to the more traditional strategy bribes buckets and pretending not to notice. And then there were the pranks. Ah, yes, the prank war of year 782 AUC. It began as these things do with a petty grievance. A tenant on the 3rd floor accused her upstairs neighbor of stomping during dinner. The upstairs neighbor accused her of leaving old figs in the stairwell. Things escalated. Chamber pots were weaponized. Someone rigged a trap involving a dangling amphora and a very confused pigeon. The building smelled of vinegar and spite for a week. Flavius tried to mediate. He ended up soaked and slightly concussed. Eventually, peace was restored when a child accidentally hit the bard in room 2B with a flying sponge. The bard-inspired composed an apology ballad so moving that several neighbors cried and one tenant forgave his mother-in-law. The truce was sealed with wine bread and the unspoken agreement that nobody would ever speak of what was done to the water jug in 4A. Still, the tension lingered. A shared latrine, or the lack thereof, was the source of many whispered feuds, loud complaints, and unfortunate surprises. One man tried to build his own plumbing system using clay pipes and dreams. It lasted 5 hours. Another tenant installed a miniature aqueduct that redirected water from a nearby bathhouse. The resulting lawsuit is still technically unresolved. Meanwhile, a particularly resourceful widow taught her grandson to pee with excellent aim directly into a rain barrel. She was both admired and feared. Flavius sometimes wondered why anyone lived in his building at all. Then he'd hear laughter through the walls, a child's feet racing down the hall, the low hum of a lullaby being sung 3 rooms away, and he'd think, yes, the building might not have toilets, but it had stories, and sometimes that was enough. Water. Elusive, moody, and frequently not where it should be. For most tenants in Flavius's building, water was not so much a resource as it was a rumor. It flowed in theory through Rome's majestic aqueducts, those marvels of stone and slope that arched across the hills like the ribs of sleeping giants. The city boasted fountains, cisterns, and public baths in abundance, but the water-like wealth mostly trickled downhill. And if you happen to live on the 5th floor of a creaky insula, maintained by a landlord with more stew recipes than engineering skills, you quickly learned one essential truth: water didn't come to you. You went to water. The ground floor tenants naturally enjoyed the most convenience. a shared tap in the courtyard, or if Flavius had paid the right bribe that year. A pipe directly connected to the street's main line provided water for drinking, cooking, and the occasional emergency sponge bath. It gurgled and spit, sometimes coughed, and on very unlucky days, it produced a small frog, but it was reliable enough. But for the rest of the building, buckets, ropes, desperation. Every morning, a small parade of tenants would shuffle down the stairs, clutching clay jars, bronze pails, amphorae, fitted with clever wooden lids, and in one notable case, a goat bladder sealed with wax. They waited their turn by the spout, whispered complaints about the water's temperature, and then began the grueling climb back up each step, an affirmation of their commitment to hygiene or soup. Some tried hauling water using pulley systems tied to their balconies. These contraptions, known unofficially as the Great Splashing, involved baskets, knotted cords, and a degree of optimism no rope truly deserved. When they failed, as they often did, pedestrians below received sudden baptisms in lukewarm cabbage broth, and tenants above received new enemies. Flavius once considered installing a proper lift system. He even consulted a man with a scroll and a very long stick who claimed to have worked with aqueducts in Gaul. The consultation lasted 10 minutes and ended with the man suggesting Flavius knock down the entire building and start again. Flavius offered him a half-eaten meat pie and politely showed him the door. Instead, a new system evolved. It began with young Crispus the bucket boy. Crispus was 10 years old, unnervingly fast and seemingly immune to fatigue. For a small fee, or a slice of fruit, or the chance to pet a certain aloof pigeon, he would carry water to any floor. Provided you were polite and didn't ask too many questions about how full the bucket actually was, he became an institution. Crispus water was a recognized brand known for its mysterious floating herbs, occasional bits of string, and the boy's signature mark, a single beetle tucked somewhere near the rim, as if to say, "Yes, I was here." Of course, relying on Crispus had its drawbacks. He was distractible. He once got into a shouting match with a laundry line that tangled his bucket mid-climb. Another time he tripped over a cat and spilled an entire delivery down the stairs, an event still referred to as the deluge of Stairwell C. And on more than one occasion, he simply vanished for hours, only to return covered in ash and claiming he'd accidentally joined a parade. Still, he got the job done, most of the time. Then there were the bribe fountains. Certain ground floor tenants realized they held power. They had access, they had pipes, and they had ambition. For the right price, they would share their water, usually through a complicated arrangement of shared jugs, whispered schedules, and highly conditional lending agreements. Marcia of Room 1B was the queen of this system. She kept a roster, a waiting list, and a secret stash of emergency wine in case tempers flared. Her water was cleaner than most, stored in amphorae wrapped in damp cloth, and she delivered it with the solemnity of a priestess. Those who displeased her found their jugs mysteriously light or their requests accidentally delayed until the 14th of next never. Historians still argue over how common rooftop cisterns were in Roman insulae. Some claim they were standard filled by pumps or rain. Others scoff, noting that most rooftops barely survived the weather, let alone supported entire water reservoirs. One source describes a failed attempt at rooftop plumbing, resulting in a sudden cascade that washed away half a baker's stall and a very surprised philosopher. In Flavius' building, there had once been a rain-catching barrel on the 5th floor, nailed to a post, stabilized by bricks and revered like a household deity. It worked for 3 days. Then someone's pet monkey possibly hallucinated, knocked it loose while trying to retrieve a stolen fig. The monkey survived. The barrel did not. After that, rainwater collection was banned, pending further monkey clarification. Of course, some tenants simply gave up and bathed at the public baths. The thermae were Rome's pride great halls of heat, steam, and social performance. But not everyone had the coin, the time, or the stomach for communal nudity with a dozen chatty strangers. One man returning from the thermae once declared he had seen his neighbor's soul, and her tattoo, in that order. So for those who remained, water became part of the daily drama. Where would it come from? Who would carry it? Would it be hot? Would it be water at all? Flavius kept a ledger of complaints related to water. It included the phrases, "My soup tastes like sandals." The bath bucket has developed a personality. Crispus says the well insulted him again. One tenant suggested the building be converted to a dry living arrangement where residents simply gave up water in favor of vinegar and intense staring. This proposal was surprisingly seconded, but ultimately rejected when someone pointed out it would end the stew nights, and no one wanted to lose stew night. Flavius, watching the courtyard fill with early morning clatter, took a long sip from his own cup and sighed. The water was lukewarm, slightly gray, and suspiciously minty. But it was water, and in a building like his, that was good enough. There was something dazzling at first glance about the entryway to Flavius's building. The sun hit the mosaic floor at just the right angle in the late afternoon, making the cracked blue tiles shimmer like a lazy river of forgetfulness. A painted bust of Neptune on the far wall grinned faintly beneath years of soot and optimistic repainting. Laurel vines climbed the columns, or possibly some kind of intelligent mold. No one could agree. To the untrained eye, it all seemed rather elegant. But this was Rome. Appearances were like politicians, slick on the outside, suspiciously damp within. And the longer you stayed in that lobby, the more it revealed itself. The smell of mildew drifting from the left stairwell, the corner where the wall had buckled subtly enough to trap unsuspecting scrolls, and the persistent damp spot beneath the statue of Fortuna, which many suspected was less a miracle spring and more a plumbing regret. Still, there were touches of former luxury. Someone had once lined the entry with bits of marble, a few of which still clung proudly to the walls, like aging actors in an ongoing tragedy. Decorative tile work depicted dolphins frolicking with entirely the wrong number of limbs. The ceiling beams bore traces of gilt paint, and behind a curtain near the stairs stood a pillar supporting nothing simply because it looked reassuring. Flavius, in one of his more ambitious phases, had even attempted to restore the place. He scrubbed the floors, hired a mosaicist to re-glue the tiny bits of tile he lasted 2 days, and left muttering about existential grout, and declared to all who would listen that his building was a respectable establishment of refined domestic dignity. Then the ceiling dripped stew. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. Room 2C, home to a kindly but oblivious widow named Fausta, had developed a cooking method that defied containment. She claimed her stew pot needed spiritual breathing space. Flavius claimed her ceiling needed a lid. When the pot finally boiled over again, it seeped down through the wooden floorboards and into the lobby, splashing upon Neptune's face with an almost symbolic sizzle. From then on, Neptune always looked mildly annoyed. Fausta apologized with wine-soaked raisins and a confession that the stew had been experimental. "I used figs this time," she said, "and something I found in a drawer. that something may have been a shoe. No one investigated further. Still, the dream of grandeur persisted. Tenants began to decorate their doorways in an effort to raise the tone. One family installed a painted bust of Minerva above their lintel. Another hung dried roses, hoping to mask the smell of boiled legumes. The poetess on floor 4 wrote a new stanza each week in chalk on her door. One particularly grim verse simply read, "The roof weeps, as do I, pay rent or die." Flavius, ever the optimist, tried to host a building beautification contest. The rules were unclear, the prizes were vague, but enthusiasm ran high. Marcia from room 1B polished her doorknob with wine vinegar and declared it reflectively philosophical. The bard hung laurel branches in an abstract formation that may or may not have been a political message. Crispus carved a goat face into the stairwell banister, which startled several guests and was later blessed by a passing priest just in case. But the crowning achievement was surely the floor mosaic in the courtyard. No one quite knew who had started it. It began with a single tile green, chipped and clearly stolen from a bathhouse. Then more appeared. A crescent, a spiral, bits of color arranged in patterns that looked accidental until they didn't. Over weeks, the mosaic grew fed by fragments of broken bowls, shattered amphorae, and tiles borrowed from the bathhouse wall. Eventually, a crude but compelling design emerged, a goat triumphant standing atop a crumbling building while lightning struck in the background. Below it, in careful lettering, "We persist." Historians still argue whether Roman apartment buildings were considered works of art or symptoms of municipal panic. The elite frowned on them, calling them fire traps and dens of noise. But others, merchants, laborers, philosophers with thin wallets, saw them as stages, microcosms, dens of disorder and human splendor. Flavius, ever the realist, called them stew buckets with aspirations. Still, there was no denying the pride that emerged from disorder. The mosaics, the painted shutters, the semi-functional garden on the roof composed mostly of weeds and good intentions. Even the plaster goat on the front step, sculpted by a tenant's son using leftover soap, earned nods of approval. One night a guest arrived from out of town, a cousin of the playwright Laelia. He wore crisp linens and a permanent expression of polite horror. Upon seeing the entrance, he muttered, "Ah, you live in an experience." "Yes," Laelia replied, gesturing toward the dripping ceiling, the humming bard, and the chalk poem that read, "Hope leaks. But still we cook. It's got atmosphere." The cousin never returned. But the building didn't mind. Its beauty was layered like its floors, like its people. Beneath the mold and mosaic grime was something stubbornly lovely, a lived-in grandeur, a domestic patchwork sewn from memory stubbornness, and an overwhelming fondness for poorly ventilated kitchens. And Flavius, despite his complaints, couldn't help but admire it, even if the walls flaked paint in the shape of vaguely accusatory faces, even if Neptune glared at him from beneath the stew stain, even if the goat sculpture outside mysteriously shifted directions every week. It was still home. Eviction day was technically a somber affair, a moment of civic resolution, legal necessity, and stern glances at unpaid rent scrolls. But in Flavius's building, it had evolved into something more elaborate, something louder, something with musicians. It started innocently enough. A tenant in room 3B, an ex-clerk with a talent for losing coin and forging excuses, had gone 5 months without paying rent. Flavius, in an uncharacteristically bureaucratic mood, decided it was time for removal. He showed up with a city guard, a scroll of condemnation, and what he thought was a firm voice. The tenant greeted him with "Whine a Lute Player" and a short one-act play titled Ode to Unjust Eviction. It featured masks, interpretive stomping, and a surprisingly moving monologue from the tenant's goat. The neighbors applauded. The guard wept. The man was regrettably still evicted, but a tradition was born. From that day on, eviction day was scheduled like a minor festival. People brought snacks. The bard composed satirical songs. The child from 2C handed out betting slips. Someone would inevitably sell grilled onions, and someone else would pretend to trip over a bucket of vinegar for comic relief. Once there was a juggler. No one knew who invited him. Flavius did his best to keep things dignified. He insisted on carrying the eviction scroll in a ceremonial pouch, which was in fact an old sock. He wore his landlord cloak, a slightly singed woolen thing, with what might have been an eagle embroidered on the back, or possibly a goose in distress. And he tried to deliver his eviction speeches with gravitas. By the authority vested in me by the fine people of this building, he would intone, standing upon an overturned crate, I hereby declare this residence briefly vacant. Then came the shouting. There was always shouting. Tenants protested, blamed relatives, cited omens, or claimed that their rent had been paid in the form of spiritual credit. One woman insisted the goat had accepted her payment. The goat declined to comment. Some tried to stall by playing instruments, others by weeping. One man faked his own fainting spell so dramatically that Flavius considered casting him in a future building-sponsored play titled Debt and Other Delusions. Once a philosopher protested his eviction by locking himself in his room and shouting Socratic riddles through the keyhole. It took 2 days, 3 scholars, and 1 very loud baker to debate him into submission. When the final decision came, always the same, always inevitable, the tenant was ushered out with as much dignity as could be managed. Belongings were handed down via ropes or baskets. One tenant refused to carry her clay busts down the stairs and demanded a pulley system be constructed. Crispus, the bucket boy, built it from broomsticks and dreams. It worked, briefly. Some evictions were quiet, a single bag, a whispered apology, a tearful glance backward. Others were grand exits. One man left while singing a love ballad to the building tears in his eyes and a sack of questionable olives on his back. Another flung flower petals from the balcony and declared, "May your leaks be ever musical," before tripping over a chamber pot and being mildly applauded. Historians still argue whether eviction in ancient Rome was as theatrical as in Flavius's case. Legally, landlords had the right to evict for unpaid rent damage to property or general unpleasantness. But enforcement was uneven. Wealthy landlords could bribe officials to expedite the process. Poorer ones relied on public shame-hired muscle, or if you were Flavius, peer pressure with musical accompaniment. Flavius once attempted a more professional route. He hired 2 men with large arms and small vocabularies to serve as relocation assistants. They lasted 1 week. One fell in love with a tenant. The other tried to unionize the goats. In the end, it was community involvement that proved most effective. The other tenants, once skeptical, began to see evictions as cathartic. They'd bring leftover stew. Rhea, the resident gossip, narrated the events like a sports announcer. She's arguing. She's bringing up the cracked stair again. Classic move. Oh, but Flavius counters with the ledger. It's tense, folks. Even the building got involved. On one particularly dramatic day, as Flavius read the eviction notice, a loose tile from the roof fell with impeccable timing and shattered beside him. Everyone gasped. Flavius nodded solemnly. "The building has spoken," he said, "and yet for all their drama, Evictions rarely lasted. Most tenants found their way back, sometimes to the same building, sometimes to the same room. Once a man was evicted, moved 2 doors down, and pretended to be his own cousin. He wore a hat. That was the entire disguise. It worked for 3 months. Flavius learned not to ask questions. He began keeping a possible returns list in the back of the ledger with columns labeled likely, unlikely, and please no. Under please no. He once wrote simply, "The guy with the flute and the chicken." You know the one. There was something endearing, though, about the resilience of it all. The way people left came back, reshaped themselves, renegotiated their place in the building. Life was unstable, Rome was expensive, but the insula remained. And so on another bright afternoon, as the bard tuned his lyre and a neighbor prepared a farewell cake, Flavius stood once again on his ceremonial crate, raised his eviction sock, and declared, "Today we part ways not in anger, but in mild inconvenience and mutual mildew." The crowd cheered, the goat sneezed, and the building, that half-collapsing miracle of timber and spirit, embraced another round of departure, return, and repetition. Because in the end, eviction wasn't the end. It was just a noisy intermission. The world didn't need reasons to go wrong in ancient Rome, but the insula always seemed to collect more than its fair share. Some buildings collapsed, some burned. Others were brought low by rot poor design or an unusually vengeful goat. But in Flavius' building, disaster had a more theatrical flair. Here chaos came in many forms: fire, flood, and most frequently philosophers. It was philosopher season again. Every few months, it seemed, a new tenant would arrive with a scroll under one arm and an aura of smugness under the other. They always claimed to be working on a treatise. They always requested the most contemplative room, which invariably turned out to be one adjacent to the building's only pipe, a goat, or Rhea the gossip. And they always cooked lentils at 3 a.m. This time the philosopher in question was Cassius, a thin man with suspiciously clean sandals and a tragic habit of monologuing to pigeons. He'd rented a 4th-floor room for its exposure to the philosophical winds and immediately set about declaiming Stoic verses from his window like an academic rooster. The building, already accustomed to noise, tried to ignore him. But Cassius was different. He didn't just speak, he projected. And he didn't just theorize, he believed that every thought, no matter how abstract, required audible rehearsal, preferably during thunderstorms. One night he staged a one-man debate with himself about the moral worth of cabbage. Neighbors leaned against their walls, listened in horror, and slowly lost the will to cook vegetables. A child cried. The goat left the courtyard. Flavius confronted him politely. "Cassius," he said, "some of the tenants are reporting disturbances." "Ah," said Cassius, setting down a scroll. "They are disturbed by the sound of enlightenment. They are disturbed by the sound of you comparing onions to the Republic." Flavius replied. Cassius promised to reflect in silence. The next night he replaced speech with interpretive stomping. Meanwhile, other disasters simmered. The roof had developed a new leak, this one not the usual soft drip, but a bold, gurgling rebellion. Rainwater poured into the stairwell like an amateur aqueduct. Tenants tried to patch it with old laundry and wine jugs, but the water only laughed and found new paths. By morning, the 2nd floor resembled a bathhouse minus the decorum. Flavius dispatched Crispus now, an experienced water runner and amateur structural analyst, to investigate. The boy returned an hour later, soaked to the knees and carrying a piece of tile that may have once belonged to the Pantheon. "I think the roof's trying to move out," he reported. Then came the fire. It began as so many Roman fires did, with an unattended oil lamp and far too many loose fabrics. A tenant named Vibia had fallen asleep reading an erotic epic, the lamp tilting ever so gently onto her woven floor mat. Smoke trickled upward. Sparks danced along the walls like drunken beetles. And then boom. Not a real boom, a Roman boom, a crackle, a pop, and a room suddenly full of regret. Thankfully, the building had systems. Not effective systems, but systems. The neighbors heard the shouting, smelled the burning tunic, and sprang into action. Someone threw a jar of stew on the flames. Another tenant tried to fan the fire out using a copy of De Rerum Natura. It mostly smoldered, then burst again when the wind joined in. Flavius arrived, tripping over a half-melted sandal, and did what he always did. In moments of crisis, he yelled water and hoped someone knew where to find it. Crispus arrived 3 minutes later with a goat bladder and a look of wild determination. Eventually the flames were subdued. Vibia, hair singed but dignity intact, declared the event a transformative poetic experience. The building lost 1 curtain, 3 floor tiles, and a part of its innocence. Flavius added a new column to the ledger fire likelihood score. And still, the tenants stayed. The building survived, not because it was sturdy, heavens no, but because it was stubborn, and because everyone knew where the exits were, more or less, and because when disaster struck, the residents rallied. Someone always found a bucket. Someone always sang a song. Someone always blamed the philosopher. Cassius, to his credit, apologized by composing a scroll-length apology in hexameter. He read it aloud from his window at dawn. Most of the tenants slept through it. A few groaned. Rhea told him to write shorter poems and throw them into the sea. Historians still argue whether Rome's insulae were marvels of urban efficiency or tragic miscalculations stacked skyward. The answer, like most things Roman, was yes. They were fire traps, flood-prone and loud. But they were also alive. Flavius knew this every time the building groaned after rain, every time the goat shifted ominously by the stairs, every time the lentil-scented philosopher shouted about metaphysics in the middle of a windstorm. Disaster would come again. It always did. But so would laughter, so would gossip, so would stew. Because in this old crumbling stack of bricks, an ambition ruin wasn't the end. It was just the start of another story. The city inspector's name was Severinus, and he was a man of principles, mostly the kind you could fold in half and tuck inside a sandal. He arrived every quarter precisely 3 days late and already annoyed. Clad in a toga that had once been white but now resembled old porridge. He carried a wax tablet, a stylus, and the unmistakable air of someone who believed his time was more valuable than the buildings he inspected. His sandals squeaked with judgment. Flavius met him at the threshold, a goblet of wine already in hand. "Welcome, Inspector," he said. "The building awaits your noble gaze." Severinus sniffed. "I heard a wall collapsed. Just a decorative arch. It collapsed with flare. I also heard about the fire. Contained we even improved ventilation." Severinus narrowed his eyes. "And the ghost?" Flavius blinked. "Which one thus?" Began the quarterly ritual, equal parts performance art and bureaucratic farce. The building, knowing it was being watched, behaved accordingly. The goat vanished. The stew smell softened to an ambiguous herbal note. The bard developed laryngitis, and someone, likely Crispus, lit a row of candles along the stairwell that gave the illusion of warmth, stability, and basic Structural integrity. Severinus always started with the walls. He poked them, he stared at them, he tapped them with the back of his stylus, and listened for echoing doom. Once he declared a wall acceptable only for it to produce a long, mournful creak that sounded suspiciously like a disapproving senator. He turned. What was that? Probably just the pipes, Flavius replied. There are no pipes in this wall. Then a very disciplined rat. Next came the ceiling, or more accurately, the concept of ceiling. Room 4A's roof was as ever in negotiations with gravity. The beams sagged like tired eyebrows. The plaster flaked like bad poetry. And in one corner, a plant had begun to grow, sprouting cheerfully from a crack that likely led to either the attic or the underworld. Severinus looked up. Is that oregano? Flavius nodded. Fresh air feature. The inspector jotted something down. It was never clear what. He once spent 30 minutes sketching a detailed drawing of a pigeon he insisted was threatening him from a ledge. Pigeons were to be fair, deeply involved in the inspection process. They nested behind shutters inside beams and once incredibly inside a wall. When Severinus pressed his ear to the plaster of room 2C, a pigeon cooed softly and a feather wafted out of the gap. I'm being mocked, he whispered. Flavius said nothing. He handed him another goblet of wine. The real test came in the courtyard. Here where the tenants gathered and chaos brewed, Flavius had staged a series of distractions, children playing quietly, Rhea humming lullabies, the mosaic goat scrubbed and shining in the sunlight. Even the bard, half-voiced and disgruntled, attempted a polite aria. It was slightly off-key and may have contained political slander, but it showed effort. Severinus was not fooled. This well is too shallow. It's a metaphor, Flavius said. The stairs are cracked. They're historic. There's a family of squirrels in this storage amphora. They pay rent, Flavius muttered. Historians still debate the actual standards of Roman building inspections. Some say inspectors were rigorous civil servants, others that they were decorative officials whose main task was to be bribed just enough to avoid causing trouble. Evidence suggests both may be true, depending on how recently the inspector had eaten and whether they feared goats. Severinus was unusually thorough. He climbed, he prodded, he interviewed tenants, most of whom gave theatrical answers. Laelia described the building as a poetic ruin steeped in stoicism and mildew. Gaius claimed the walls whispered compliments. The philosopher Cassius cornered Severinus for 30 minutes to discuss whether buildings had moral obligations. Severinus emerged from that conversation visibly older. By late afternoon, the ledger was full. Flavius braced himself. Well, he asked, hoping the wine had done its work. Severinus paused. The building is standing. A good start. It's dangerously flammable, spiritually or literally. There's an alarming amount of goat-related activity. They keep morale up. Severinus sighed. You have until the next inspection to address at least 3 of the following: the roof, the stairwell moss, the ghost ledger, the bucket system, and the fire tiles. Flavius blinked. Fire tiles? I invented that category just now, Severinus said, scribbling with flourish. You know what they are. Then, as always, came the bribe. Not overt, not even direct. Just a quiet cup of better wine, a private moment in the courtyard, and a scroll Flavius presented with a smile that said, "Let's not pretend this is about paperwork." Severinus accepted it with the long-suffering grace of a man who knew exactly what kind of world he lived in. He sipped, he nodded, and he walked away muttering, "At least no one threw stew at me this time." Flavius watched him go. Another inspection survived, another performance complete. and the building, as if pleased with itself, gave a low groan and dropped a bit of plaster on the floor. The tenants resumed their noise. The goat reappeared near the stairs. Someone began arguing with the laundry line again. And Flavius, he picked up the stylus Severinus had left behind and scribbled a new category into his own ledger. Inspections survived, 14 goats bribed. Technically none fire tiles pending, because in a Roman apartment building truth was always negotiable, and so thankfully was bureaucracy. Of all the complaints that echoed through Flavius's building, cracked stairs, stew-based injuries, mysterious ceiling whispers, the most frequent by far was noise. Rome was not a city that slept. It yawned, it dozed, it muttered into its wine. But true silence was as rare as a punctual city inspector. And inside the insula, silence was practically illegal. Every wall breathed sound, every floorboard carried rhythm, and every tenant, whether intentionally or not, contributed to the ongoing opera of squeaks, sighs, and outright screaming. It always started early. First came the babies. There were always babies. Somewhere in the building at any given hour, at least one infant was discovering their voice, usually around sunrise, usually at a pitch capable of frightening furniture. The couple in 3A had twins. They cried in shifts, as if coordinating across divine time zones. One would begin a mournful wail, just as the other drifted off, creating a ceaseless loop of what Flavius referred to somewhat unkindly as the chorus of sleep denial. Neighbors coped in various ways. Rhea, the first-floor widow, claimed she could predict the weather based on baby screams. Laelia, the playwright, began working infant tantrums into her scripts. The bard simply left notes outside the couple's door. Key of B flat this morning. Strong form. Consider adding a harmony. Then came the musicians. Rome was a city full of them. Itinerant flute players, amateur lyre pluckers, percussionists with a questionable relationship to rhythm. They came and went, often leaving behind instruments' debts and at least one broken stool. One particularly passionate musician took up residence in 2D with a bag of bones, a tambourine, and something he called the wind drum. This was in reality a cracked pot full of beans he shook enthusiastically at dawn. He was evicted after his third performance of Ode to the Wind, Part 7. The goat, previously tolerant of many things, had headbutted the drum and walked away without comment. But it wasn't just babies and bards. Arguments had their own schedule. Married couples fought in careful crescendos. Roommates bickered like trained orators. One set of neighbors developed a structured debate system for handling disputes over laundry, complete with rotating judges and point cards. Crispus, the bucket boy, was briefly nominated to mediate. He accepted, then declared all parties guilty of excessive shouting and fined them 3 figs apiece. Some tenants simply had loud personalities. There was Aelia, who never closed a door without announcing her action in 3 tenses. There was Lucius, who recited his daily to-do list to the pigeons on his balcony. And then there was Cassius the philosopher, who had recently taken to sleep-talking in ancient Etruscan. One morning Flavius found a scroll slipped under his door that read, "Dear Dominus, the building is alive with voices. Please ask it to whisper. Signed, everyone except Cassius." Even the inanimate seemed noisy. The stairs creaked like they were gossiping. The shutters clattered opinions in the wind. The front door had developed a persistent, wheezing groan whenever opened, leading some to believe it was haunted by the spirit of a long-dead doorman named Guy. Historians still argue whether Roman buildings were ever truly quiet. The city was dense, apartments stacked like bread slices in a basket left out during a feast. Noise drifted through cracks under doors, up chimneys, and occasionally down from the gods themselves, in the form of thunder war drums, or that one chariot racer who practiced turns at midnight. Flavius tried solutions. He distributed cloth strips for door gaps. He suggested silent hours between the third and fifth hour of the night. He once even hosted a building-wide lullaby hour with the bard playing a gentle tune meant to calm nerves. It worked for 12 minutes. Then a pigeon flew into the flute. Then a baby woke up. Then someone dropped a jar of pickled garlic. Chaos resumed its natural rhythm. There was something oddly comforting in the noise, though. Like a badly tuned lyre, the building's harmony was messy, unpredictable, and sometimes deeply emotional, and it was never truly boring. One night Flavius stood in the courtyard with a cup of wine and listened. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He heard a lullaby from the top floor. He heard laughter from the stairwell. He heard someone snoring like a bear, wrapped in a toga. And in the corner the goat let out a quiet murr, not a bleat, not quite a burp, but something in between. He smiled. Still better than the Senate, he muttered, because in the insula, every sound meant someone was still there, still living, still singing or arguing or playing badly tuned wind drums. And as long as the walls echoed, the building still had a story to tell. Among the cracked beams and creeping vines of Flavius's building was a secret most visitors never noticed: hidden messages etched into the ceiling tiles. Now these weren't the usual curses or rude drawings left by drunken tenants. No, these were delicate, deliberate inscriptions, faint lines scratched into plaster with a precision far too tidy for a broom handle, symbols tucked between paint flakes, tiny Latin phrases that didn't quite make sense. They whispered from above, "Beware the third window," or "The fish lies stillest on Tuesdays." It had started with a rumor. As rumors often do, it began with a bard and a sleepless night. I saw it, he told anyone who would listen. An augur used to live here before the goat, before the cracked stairs. He etched his prophecies into the ceiling so only the deserving would see them. Why the ceiling, someone asked. He was upside down at the time, the bard replied, not helpfully. The story should have faded, but one morning, Lelia the playwright was scrubbing soot from her ceiling because her upstairs neighbor had attempted to cook soup with firewood and optimism again, when she noticed a small line of script just above her bed. "When olives fall, beware the spoon." She showed it to Flavius. Flavius, who had seen worse on bathroom walls, squinted. Maybe it's a recipe, but more messages followed. Room 2B had "Speak not to the pigeon in green." Room 4C, "She knows about the stew." Room 3A simply read, "Regret echoes." Historians still argue about the presence of graffiti in Roman homes. Some villas contained philosophical quotes. Others bore scrawled vulgarities, often involving figs, politicians, or the moral failures of one's mother. But ceiling writing was rare, which of course made it more interesting. Soon the entire building became obsessed. Tenants lay on beds, necks craned, squinting at flaking plaster like oracles, deciphering omens. They brought lamps, candles, even mirrors to peer into corners. The poetess on the 4th floor claimed her ceiling read, "Forgive the goat." It did what it must. Crispus discovered one tile above the stairwell that, when lightly tapped, seemed to echo a faint "don't." The building hummed with theory. Lelia believed the messages were warnings from a hidden society of retired augurs. Cassius the philosopher argued they were the result of subconscious prophecy echoing from the minds of ancient tenants in their sleep. Rhea, of course, had her own explanation. I once dated an augur, she said proudly. He couldn't write. This is the work of a bored librarian. Regardless of their source, the tiles took on meaning. One tenant refused to sleep. Beneath a certain patch, convinced, it whispered soon in thunder. Another began wearing a helmet indoors because his ceiling advised guard your head. The bard claimed to have composed an entire tragedy inspired by the phrase he ate the last plum. Flavius, initially dismissive, began recording them in the ledger. Not in the rent section. No, he created a new scroll, folded into quadrants, annotated with charcoal and labeled suspicious ceiling. He noted patterns. Messages tended to appear above beds, baths, or bean storage. No one ever found a message above the goat. One particularly rainy night, a tile fell from the 5th floor ceiling and narrowly missed the philosopher's foot, scratched onto its underside too late now. Cassius, undeterred, framed it. Of course, not every inscription was profound. One tenant found Nice tunic above his doorway. Another found a crude drawing of a cat riding a chariot. And someone, no one would admit, who etched Flavius smells like soup in room 1C, which was unfair. He smelled like stew and everyone knew it. Still, the tiles united the tenants in ways Flavius hadn't expected. They debated meanings, hosted ceiling reading gatherings, and created maps of the messages. The mosaic courtyard goat was decorated with quotes like, "The ceiling sees and duck when whistled at." Even the most cynical residents began to look up, perhaps for answers, perhaps for the thrill of being puzzled by something that defied leaking pipes and rent. There was something comforting about it. The idea that the building was trying to speak, that beneath the mildew and mortar it held memories, that long ago someone augur or prankster had felt the need to leave a message for the future scratched above them while Rome bustled below. Flavius wasn't sentimental, but one evening after the rain had calmed and the pigeons were asleep, he sat on his creaking stool and looked up. There above the main stairwell in faded lettering was a new message. It read, "He keeps it standing." Mostly. He stared at it for a long while. Then he chuckled, drank his wine, and wrote a reply on the beam with charcoal. "Doing my best." Festivals in Rome were in principle a time for joy, a time for torches and tambourines, wreaths, and overcooked meats. Public speeches about virtue and private decisions to ignore them entirely. A time when the city exploded in noise light and more than a few legal exceptions. And naturally a time when someone often from Flavius's building fell off something they probably shouldn't have been on in the first place. In a more stable city, festival season might bring structured parades and gently scheduled cheer. In Rome, it brought mayhem. And to a Roman insula, it brought chaos so dense you could almost bottle it, label it essence of calamity, and sell it in the forum. The trouble began at dawn on the day of Saturnalia. First came the drums, soft at first, then louder, then followed by someone singing about poultry in a key no musician recognized. Flavius opened his eyes to find Crispus already in the stairwell, covered in garlands and trying to catch a pigeon with a laurel crown. Why, Flavius asked, not yet caffeinated. "It's for the ceremony," Crispus replied, as if that explained anything. By mid-morning the building had transformed. The poetess on floor 4 was composing a dramatic ode titled, "O Saturn, why hast thou drenched my laundry?" The philosopher Cassius, now fully invested in festive metaphysics, had tied scrolls to his toga and declared himself a walking debate. And the baker's assistant from 2A had erected an illegal stew stall in the courtyard, selling cups of something that smelled like burnt ambition and onions. Flavius made the rounds. "Take down the banner," he said, pointing to a suspiciously slippery piece of linen hanging from the third-floor balcony. "It's festive," the tenant argued. "It says, 'free soup,' or else." As always, festivals brought people together, and then immediately caused them to bump into each other until mild resentment blossomed. Children ran up and down the stairs, wearing masks shaped like Saturn Jupiter and bafflingly a goat. One got stuck in the banister. The bard composed a satirical verse about it on the spot, only to trip over a fallen fig and fall directly into a bucket of celebratory wine. The crowd applauded. Then came the performances. You see, tenants couldn't let the forum have all the drama. The building had its own theater, a loose rectangle of paving stones in the courtyard, bordered by 2 broken stools and 1 pile of decorative rubble. It had been unofficially named the Stage of Regret after a mime tripped there and fell into the stew. Today's program included a puppet show based loosely on Romulus and Remus, featuring betrayal wool and moderate biting, followed by a short 1-act comedy titled "No, That's My Toga," performed entirely by residents of the second floor. The show went well until someone's toga actually got stolen mid-performance, causing a genuine argument to blend seamlessly into the fiction. The audience assumed it was part of the act and awarded them a turnip and half a boiled egg as tokens of approval. Upstairs, balconies sagged under the weight of onlookers. Tenants waved ribbons. Someone threw flower petals, possibly on purpose. And from room 3C, a pigeon emerged, wearing what appeared to be a tiny cape. Rhea claimed it was her doing. "He's the spirit of the building," she said, proudly sipping wine from a cracked goblet. "I named him Marcus Aurelius the Feathery." Flavius made no comment. He simply updated the ledger, "Pigeon deity confirmed." As the day wore on, the music grew louder. Someone brought out a lyre. Someone else brought out spoons. One tenant claimed to be a former priestess of Bacchus and demonstrated by standing on the roof and singing into a vase. Flavius attempted crowd control. He assigned Crispus to direct stair traffic. He created a wine zone, mostly the left corner of the courtyard, away from the fire barrel. He tried to get the philosopher to stop reading Plato at full volume from the laundry line. It all unraveled when someone fell off a balcony. Now, to be clear, the fall wasn't serious. It was more of a tumble, a roll, and a very soft landing into an empty cabbage cart. The crowd gasped, then applauded. The bard declared it symbolic of man's fall from clarity, and someone handed the fallen man a meat pie as consolation. Still, it was enough to warrant intervention. The city guard arrived shortly after sundown, drawn by noise complaints and allegedly a report of an insula attempting to host a chariot race indoors. Flavius greeted them with a plate of olives and a scroll pre-written with several excuses. "It's a modest celebration," he said, smiling tightly. "There's a goat dressed as Mercury," said the guard. "It was voted on. There's a stew fire under the staircase. It's symbolic. And someone is attempting to baptize a statue of Minerva using wine and interpretive dance." Art, the guards sighed, collected their olives, and left, after being promised they could attend the next performance as honored observers. One of them requested front row seating. Flavius wrote it down. Festivals, for all their madness, did something remarkable to the building. They blurred the cracks. They softened the mildew. They made the insula feel for a brief and luminous moment like the center of the world. Even Neptune, still glaring from the mosaic in the entryway, seemed to scowl with slightly less menace that night, and Flavius, covered in confetti stew and unconfirmed pigeon feathers, leaned back against the doorframe and smiled, because In the end, what was a Roman apartment building, if not a stage leaky, loud, and occasionally on fire, but alive with people who danced, shouted, laughed, and sang into the darkness. Until someone fell off something. Again. If you've ever tried to cram a philosopher, a goat, and a street-licensed fishmonger into one apartment building and expect serenity then, you have a very unusual imagination, and perhaps a future in Roman land management. Flavius, for one, had long given up on the concept of compatibility. Tenants arrived with their own baggage, both physical and psychological, and promptly began a slow war of friction against whomever lived closest or loudest. There was no vetting process. People moved in when they could pay or convincingly promised to soon, and Flavius, like any seasoned landlord, simply prayed they would cancel each other out like awkward musical notes in a crowded tavern. But some neighbors were destined never to coexist. Take Decima, the soap merchant, for instance. A woman of strong chin and stronger opinions, she occupied room 1D and maintained a strict schedule: wake at dawn, scrub everything within reach, and denounce uncleanliness through open windows. Her upstairs neighbor Tullus was a street performer who believed in the cleansing power of natural odors. His presence offended Decima. His socks offended everyone. Their feud began with a dropped tunic. Decima accused Tullus of drying his laundry too close to her basil plant. He accused her basil of smelling like old senators. Things escalated. Notes were left. Chamber pots were misdelivered. At one point, Decima started her own soap-based system of curses, smearing olive oil inscriptions above his door that read things like "Repent, you stinker." Flavius tried to mediate. They both blamed him. Then there were the gladiator twins. No, they weren't actual gladiators. They were butchers who practiced wrestling on the balcony to attract business. Marcus and Gaius, identical in muscle and mischief, lived in 2C and 2D respectively, and had once knocked down a support beam mid-duel. They claimed it was a training accident. Flavius claimed it was the moment he lost hope in structural integrity. Their neighbors included a flute player with severe stage fright who screamed whenever someone sneezed, a seamstress who insisted silence was crucial to stitch alignment, a retired city clerk with an iron lung and a personal vendetta against noise youth and cooking smells. One afternoon, the twins hosted a meat showcase complete with banners, smoked ham, and an audience of confused pigeons. The seamstress fainted. The clerk filed a complaint in triplicate. The flute player climbed into a closet and stayed there until midnight. Flavius handed out apology wine and reclassified the balcony as recreational storage. Then there was Felina, a fortune teller who read omens and stew. She lived quietly until she didn't. Every few weeks she announced a vision. One morning she claimed that room 3B's bed was cursed. The next week she declared the goat was a harbinger of civic change. The goat for once appeared flattered. Her neighbor Numerius was a census clerk who believed in only what could be written in ledgers. He accused Felina of narrative fraud. She accused him of possessing the soul of a pickled radish. They argued through the wall for months, culminating in a passive-aggressive display in which she hung garlic above his doorway, and he responded by reading statistics aloud every evening in a monotone. Some neighbors tried to solve conflicts creatively. A pair of brothers once divided their shared apartment with a curtain, agreeing to communicate only via scrolls slid under the fabric. This worked until one of them began writing poetry on the scrolls, and the other developed a mysterious rash. He blamed on metaphors. Another tenant declared a noise truce by bribing his neighbors with warm bread and wine. It lasted 3 days until he tried to enforce silence during festival prep and found his doormat on fire. Historians have plenty to say about Roman urban density. The insulae were never meant to foster harmony. They were vertical puzzles of class culture and clashing lives. Tenants of different incomes, beliefs, and cooking methods were stacked like mismatched amphorae. Privacy was rare, judgment was constant, and peace, when it came, was usually after midnight, when everyone was too tired to argue or had temporarily lost their voices. Flavius often said the building had moods. Some days it hummed contentedly. Other days it growled, groaned, and dropped plaster with the precision of a vengeful ancestor. Still, not all neighbor stories were tragic. Some found strange companionship. The bard and the soapmaker formed a musical cleaning service that left floors sparkling and hearts confused. The pigeon trainer and the seamstress co-wrote a song about birds and bobbins that became inexplicably popular with children. Even Cassius the philosopher, after months of offending nearly everyone, struck up a deep, if loud, friendship with the woman who made pickled turnips on floor 3. Their joint lecture on ethics and root vegetables was considered a landmark event in the courtyard. Flavius, despite his misgivings, found himself moved. It wasn't harmony, it wasn't peace, but it was something, an ongoing friction that occasionally sparked laughter, a weaving of lives so strange and so close that even the goat seemed invested in the outcome. And when a new tenant moved in, a quiet scholar with too many scrolls and a nervous twitch, Flavius simply handed him the key and said, "You'll fit right in." He didn't specify with whom, because in a Roman insula you didn't find neighbors. You earned them. There was a scent in the building that no one could identify and no one could escape. It lived in all the stairwells. It clung to the drapes. It followed you up from the courtyard, like a polite but persistent ghost. It was not sewage that had its own department of blame, nor was it mildew that scent was seasonal. No, this was something far more specific, something you could trace back to one singular, ancient, ever-boiling truth: cabbage. Boiled, braised, fermented, forgotten. The form didn't matter. The result was the same: a slow, steady aroma of vegetal despair. No one remembered when it started. Some said it began with an old widow named Livia, who used to live on the 4th floor and cooked cabbage thrice a day for her joints. Others swore the smell had simply always been there, as if the building had been constructed with cabbage mortar and pickled dreams. Flavius tried to investigate once. He knocked on doors. He sniffed under carpets. He examined stew pots and shouted politely into air vents. Every resident denied responsibility. "I don't even eat vegetables," one man swore as he spooned what was clearly cabbage soup into his mouth. "It's probably coming from outside," another offered, despite the fact that the scent strengthened the higher one climbed. Room 5A claimed it was a spiritual presence. "It's the ghost of all the bad meals Rome has ever cooked," the tenant whispered. "It's judgmental." Cassius naturally had opinions. "The cabbage," he declared from his balcony, "represents the layered soul. We fear its essence because we fear our own root systems." No one understood what he meant, least of all the pigeons nesting in his windowsill. Eventually Flavius gave up. He wrote "persistent cabbage unsolvable" in the ledger and moved on. But the smell remained, like an old memory, like a story everyone knew but no one admitted to telling. Tenants adapted. Marcia, ever resourceful, began hanging lavender sachets in the hallway. The bard composed a haunting ballad called "O Stew of Unknown Source." It featured a solo on the cheese grater and several notes only dogs could hear. The soap maker tried to combat it chemically, producing a pungent citrus bar so strong it peeled the paint off the ceiling in 2B. Flavius even consulted a man from the market who claimed to be a scent displacement expert. He charged 3 denarii, lit a series of herbal sticks, and waved a feather in each corner of the stairwell while chanting something that might have been a recipe. The building responded by releasing more cabbage scent. And that's when the legend began. Children whispered of a cabbage spirit, a guardian of domestic perseverance. It only appears when someone lies about liking the stew, said one. If you drop a meatball, it watches, said another. Crispus insisted he'd once seen it during a full moon hovering near the laundry line. It looked like a mist, a leafy mist, and it had eyes. Laelia wrote a short play about it. The goat was cast as the spirit. The audience was deeply confused. One day during an inspection, Severinus, the city official, wrinkled his nose at the entryway. Smells like unfulfilled ambition and vegetables, tradition, Flavius said firmly, and handed him a goblet of wine. Historians still debate Roman attitudes toward cabbage. Some sources describe it as a respected medicinal food. Others call it a poor man's staple. One scroll claims a senator tried to outlaw it after an unfortunate wedding feast. Another swears it could cure melancholy if applied directly to the feet. Whatever the truth in Flavius's building, cabbage had become more than a food. It was an institution, a shared experience, a challenge. It permeated everything: letters, linens, and occasionally dreams. One tenant swore she dreamed of a cabbage offering her life advice. Don't trust people who oversalt, it had said. She took it to heart. And yet, despite the endless complaints, the awkward glances, and the use of 5 different perfumes in one stairwell, no one really wanted it to go. It was part of the place, a gentle reminder that life was lived here not in marble corridors or scented atriums, but in steam-filled kitchens with leaky ceilings and gossiping pots. Because for all its faults, cabbage had one undeniable power. It brought people together, in shared complaints, in late-night jokes, in whispered theories over cups of slightly too warm wine, and in the quiet hours when the building creaked and the rain tapped gently on the rooftop tiles that hadn't yet fallen. That scent curled softly through the air, not as a warning, but as a lullaby, a leafy, sulphurous lullaby. Flavius, sitting at his ledger, paused to sniff the air. He smiled. Still here, old friend. And somewhere beneath someone's bed, a forgotten pot bubbled slowly on. The stairwell had no rules. There were no posted notices, no official system, and certainly no city-backed guidance on who walked where, when, or why. Someone had placed a bronze bust of Mercury on the 3rd landing with a sock on its head. But somehow the building's economy, its true economy, thrived there, not the rent. That was for ledgers and arguments. This was the unspoken economy, a system of favors, bribes, barters, and bread loaves passed hand to hand in the dim half-light of the 2nd-floor bend. It began as most shadow economies do, with silence, or more precisely, with the price of it. One day a tenant from 3C heard something she wasn't supposed to. A conversation very loud, very dramatic, between 2 neighbors who had once been lovers, then enemies, then business partners, selling bootleg wine from an attic jug. The woman from 3C, who owned several cats and 3 times as many secrets, let it be known that she had heard everything. But she added with a wink she was very forgetful when given a nice honey cake. Thus was born the bribe economy. From that moment on, information in the building flowed not with currency, but with carbs. Bread was king. Biscuits were backup. Wine was a luxury, but almost too obvious, and stew was reserved for serious transactions, like bribing someone not to report your illegal bean fermenting closet or convincing Rhea not to repeat that thing you said when you thought no one was listening. Rhea, of course, was central to the system. She claimed not to participate in bribes. She preferred to call them conversational encouragements. Her going rate was 2 slices of fruit loaf or on special days a meat pie with proper crust. She had once been given a single fig in exchange for silence. She talked about that fig for a year. Even Crispus had a price. He wouldn't carry a note or a bucket or a secret without some form of edible compensation. Once, when offered a coin, he stared at it and said, "Does this taste like cheese?" The tenant wisely withdrew the offer and produced a small wedge of goat milk cheddar instead. Flavius was not immune to the system. In theory, he ran the building. In practice, he was constantly being offered unsolicited snacks in exchange for minor omissions. A broken tile ignored. A forgotten late rent. A stew-related explosion gently reclassified as a culinary event gone sideways. He kept a drawer officially labeled documents of interest filled with cheese rinds, half-wrapped pastries, and one very old lentil cake no one wanted to talk about. Some trades were surprisingly complex. A tenant offered to sweep the courtyard for a week in exchange for immunity from ghost rumors. Another gifted Flavius a live chicken in exchange for not evicting her brother who had attempted to make soap in the laundry basin. The chicken was named Claudia. It lived for 6 weeks on the roof and laid precisely 1 egg, which Cassius declared symbolic of moral uncertainty. No one ate it. There was also a thriving favor ledger maintained unofficially by Laelia the playwright. She tracked who owed whom. Marcia had helped Gaius carry 6 amphorae in the rain. Gaius lent Marcia his stew pot during festival week. Marcia then told the inspector that Gaius's ceiling leak was entirely spiritual. Gaius owed her 3 buns. This system, while absurd, was respected. If you failed to repay a favor, your name was added to the wall of mild shame. A chalkboard near the stairwell, listing infractions such as returned pot unwashed or used laundry basin for non-laundry activities. Flavius, trying to remain above it all, once attempted to ban these trades. He made a speech. He wore a toga. He gestured grandly. By the end, he had received 2 loaves of bread, 3 pickles, and a poem about his knees. He folded. Historians naturally don't record this kind of commerce. They write about taxes, imports, and coinage, but not about how one actually got through the day in a Roman apartment, not how barter replaced bureaucracy, not how a strategically placed wheel of cheese could stop a feud, or how a single bowl of olive tapenade could make a neighbor forget that you once screamed at the moon during a thunderstorm. And certainly not how a goat still unnamed, still unnervingly present, once arbitrated a trade between 2 tenants by standing beside one and not the other until consensus was reached. Flavius learned to listen to the goat, and so the building pulsed with quiet exchanges. A jar left on a windowsill, a loaf wedged into a stair rail, a whispered promise of, "I'll pretend not to notice if you pretend not to notice." The true economy of the building wasn't in coins. It was in silence favors food and occasionally questionable flattery. And that, Flavius thought, as he unwrapped a parcel of olives left anonymously on his doorstep, was probably worth more than rent. Courtyard B was in theory a place for laundry and occasional sunlight. In practice, it was ruled by goats. No one remembered when they first arrived. The initial goat may have been a gift, a pet, or an escaped ceremonial offering that simply forgot to leave. Whatever its origin, it brought with it a certain gravitational pull, soon joined by a second, then a third, and then a scruffy elder goat with one horn and a gaze like a disappointed magistrate. They didn't live in the courtyard. They occupied it. Their leader, known unofficially as Tribune Butterscotch, established dominance early by headbutting the corner of a marble planter until it cracked, then perching atop it like a fur-covered war god. The residents adapted. At first there were complaints. They ate my scroll. They chewed my sandals. They looked at me like that. You know the way Flavius, whose authority had already been questioned by ghosts, stew, and poorly placed musical performances considered removal. He tried luring them with figs. They ate the figs and returned. He tried fencing them out. They leapt over the fence. He tried negotiating softly in Latin. Tribune Butterscotch stared at him and knocked over a jug of olive oil. So Flavius did what any weary Roman landlord would do. He gave them a title, the Goat Council of Courtyard B. He even wrote it in the ledger. From that day forward, the goats were no longer a nuisance. They were a presence, a localized divinity. Tenants left small offerings, apple cores, worn mittens, one poem carved into a fig. The Goat Council responded with stoic indifference, except when it came to rent disputes. The bard was the first to notice. He'd failed to pay his rent on time again, and while composing a vaguely apologetic sonnet found Butterscotch blocking his path to the stairwell. He moved left. The goat moved left. He stepped back. The goat advanced. Eventually the bard offered a song. The goat sniffed once and walked away. Word spread. If the Goat Council stood in your path, it meant judgment. If they chewed your laundry, you had likely said something unkind about your neighbor. If they perched on your balcony, you had probably overcharged someone for lentil stew. Laelia wrote an entire play about them, Capra Senatus, a tragedy, in 4 bleats. It was performed once rained on halfway through, and declared spiritually complex but logistically confusing. Crispus believed the goats could detect lies. If you tell one, they appear. What happens then? No one knows, he whispered. No one lies twice. Still not everyone loved the Goat Council. Room 1C had an ongoing feud after a nanny goat chewed through their curtain during a nap. Marcia tried to get her water jug back after a goat knocked it over and then stared at her for 23 minutes. She lost that staring contest and possibly a part of her soul. But others embraced them. The children fed them breadcrumbs and sang songs. The soap maker claimed their presence improved her soap. The philosopher declared them living critiques of human vanity. One festival, someone knit them tiny laurels. One goat wore it for 3 seconds before eating it. The others considered, then respectfully declined. Historians rarely mention goats in Roman housing. They speak of dogs, cats, occasional monkeys on chains. But goats were country creatures, beasts of burden, symbols of rustic life. And yet here in the tangled heart of urban chaos they reigned. Flavius learned to consult them. When a tenant claimed innocence, he would check the courtyard. If a goat stood nearby, he hesitated. If Butterscotch scratched the ground twice and turned away, Flavius nodded and waved the complaint. One particularly stormy afternoon, a city official arrived unannounced. He stepped into Courtyard B. A goat stared him down. The man paused, looked at Flavius, and muttered, "I'll come back tomorrow." He never did. Over time, the courtyard evolved. The residents called it the Forum Capra. Someone painted a crude mural, goats atop broken columns, under the motto, Sine Capri Nihil. Without goats, nothing. It was slightly misspelled. No one cared. And at the center always was Butterscotch. old, silent, watching. No one ever heard him bleat. Rhea claimed he once spoke a single word to her, beware. But she was drinking warm wine at the time, so her testimony was considered unreliable. Still, the belief remained that the Goat Council kept the building from tipping into full madness, that their judgment mattered, that when the stairwell cracked, the roof leaked, the philosopher made lentil smoke signals, and the inspector threatened to shut them down. It was the silent presence of hooves in the courtyard that kept things together. And so Flavius adjusted the ledger once more. Goat Council, active influence, significant bribes accepted. Apple's poems, silence. He looked out the window. There they were, chewing, watching, waiting, and in some strange, soot-streaked, stew-scented way, holding it all in place. Night settled slowly over Rome. It didn't fall so much as it seeped like wine through an old tunic, like warmth from a cooling hearth, like stories slipping from mouths already drifting toward dreams. And in the insula of Flavius, that tired, creaking, gloriously confused building, tucked between the olive merchant and the alley, where someone always seemed to be arguing with a cartwheel, night meant something rare. Stillness. Not silence. Never silence, but a softer kind of noise. The lull of late stew, the creak of shutters easing, closed the muffled murmur of someone telling a story for the third time, and being interrupted less with each telling. The courtyard lay in shadow now, save for a single lantern near the stairs, flickering like it wasn't entirely committed to its job. The mosaic goat glimmered under soot and starlight. The real goats had curled into themselves like lumpy throw pillows. Tribune butterscotch. Among them, one eye open, just in case someone tried to sneak by with unpaid rent or poorly salted beans. Crispus had finally gone to bed. He'd left his sandals on the wrong feet and a trail of fig stems behind him. Someone would trip over one in the morning. Possibly Rhea, who claimed to never sleep, but had been suspiciously quiet since sundown. Flavius sat just inside the doorway, a woolen blanket draped across one shoulder ledger, open but ignored in his lap. There were notes he should make about the cracked third-floor beam, the spoon-based incident at the water jug, and the philosophical argument that nearly became a pie fight, but they could wait. Tomorrow was for records. Tonight was for reflection. He sipped wine gone half cold. The cup had a chip shaped like Sicily. He liked that. Gave it character. Above him the building settled with a deep wood-grained sigh. A shutter clicked softly. Somewhere on the 5th floor, a cat walked across a beam with the confidence of Caesar and the grace of a pigeon. And below, in the gentle glow of near darkness, the building breathed. You could almost hear it, an inhale of wind, an exhale of old stone, an older stew. Not haunted, not broken, just lived in. Warmed by countless arguments patched by too many well-meaning hands and held together not by mortar, but by memory. Flavius leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and smiled. He'd known marble villas. He'd walked through homes with silk curtains and cold, unspoken dinners. But none of them creaked quite like this. None of them held so many voices overlapping in that strange, unstoppable way that meant people were really living. Here beneath 7 sagging floors and a sky speckled with smoke lived philosophers and soap makers, poets and pranksters, children who believed pigeons could tell the future, and a goat who might very well be right. And here, somehow impossibly, everything endured. Not gracefully, not neatly, but faithfully. A final breeze tiptoed through the courtyard, carrying the last embers of burnt onion and someone's whispered lullaby. The building gave one last sleepy groan. Flavius reached for the ledger and in a rare moment of sentiment turned to the very back. There, between oil smudges and soup stains, he wrote, "Status still standing. Occupants wild, strange, lovable, future unclear, but very noisy." He closed the book. The flame in the lantern flickered once, then twice. And then the streets of Rome lie quiet now. Beyond the walls of the insula, carts rest in their sheds. Market stalls sleep beneath damp cloth. Even the forum has gone still save for a single moth dancing above the statue of an emperor who once ruled the world and now rules only pigeons. Inside the stone walls, remember, they hold warmth like an old friend's embrace, and the floor, cool underfoot, carries the soft weight of footsteps long since vanished. Somewhere water drips not impatiently, but as a kind of lullaby, steady kind, inevitable. The last stew of the night has gone cold. A child murmurs in sleep, and the goat shifts softly in the straw, as if acknowledging that all is well at least for now. The sky overhead glows faintly with the memory of day, and in the cradle of shadow and story beneath the cracked ceilings and hopeful beams, the building settles, still here, still holding, still home. Everything's quiet now, you're safe, let the rest take you.